Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Steve Johnson, and recently I ran a workshop for my university, Columbia International University, on writing arguments, because in the courses I teach, all the writing they do is argument, and I just thought that it might be good to open that up to all the students at the university. But now I am putting this online in case others are required to write arguments in your own courses, and maybe you will find this helpful. So I have a PowerPoint that I will be working through, and let me just see if I can pull up the PowerPoint and share that with you. Okay. So here it is, and so let me begin. Again, this is writing arguments, and we at the university we call this Mango Monday. This is when we do a lot of our workshops, and so thus the title. And as we proceed, again, it's Columbia International University, and I'm Dr. Johnson. So let me move into this presentation. It's in two parts. One, I'm looking at how to go about writing a good argument. And once I do that and cover that in some detail, then I want to move to writing an excellent argument, just going a little step further that might be more relevant to some of you in upper level undergrad and graduate level courses, okay? So let's begin by looking at the parts of an argument. Not that you need to remember all of this, but if you remember what is involved so that you can include this in a paper, that might be really helpful. An argument has to make a claim. For example, I could claim it is warm outside today here in South Carolina, or it's important for all students to know how to write arguments. So that's a claim. I haven't given any reasons to support my claim, but that's the second part of an argument. Is an argument doesn't just make claims, it gives supporting reasons to, in other words, kind of evidence to for believing the claim. And often, one of the best ways that we can combine the claim and the general supporting reasons for that claim is really from the ancient Greeks. They called it an enthymeme. And an enthymeme or an enthymeme is where you make a claim, you stick the word because in there, and following the word because in the sentence, you just state the supporting reasons. And I'll give some examples of that in just a few minutes. So we have a claim, we have supporting reasons, and we can combine them into an enthymeme, which is really nice as a thesis statement in your paper. And then we give grounds. This would be bits of evidence for the supporting reasons. We have to have evidence because an argument is supposed to be logically persuasive, and to be logically persuasive, we need evidence. Now, there are two other parts of an argument, and sometimes they're not actually written in the argument, but they are present. I know that sounds kind of spooky, but there are always assumptions that are made by the writer, and one word that we use for the assumptions of the writer is warrants. And as I said, they're often not included in the argument, but if we do include them, if we become aware of what our assumptions are and include them in the argument, that's really going to strengthen the argument, because it lets the reader know that we have been very careful and thoughtful in developing this argument. Now, sometimes our assumptions might need evidence that backs up those assumptions, and we call that evidence for the assumptions or the warrants backing. So these are the major parts of an argument, and I will begin to look at those in more detail. So let me look at this claim that all students should take a workshop on writing an argument, that all CIU students, so that's the university at which I teach, that all CIU students should take a workshop on writing an argument. That's the claim. But I haven't given any supporting reasons, so I would brainstorm about the supporting reasons. Excuse me. Some of my supporting reasons might be arguments are the major form of writing in an academic setting, so it's important to know how to write an argument. That arguments are more logically persuasive than other forms of writing, such as writing fiction or something, narrative. And that arguments include the evidence supporting the points made by the author, which is also more logically persuasive. So let me put these two together, the claim and the supporting reasons, and do it in the form of an ontheme. It would be, remember, it's the claim plus the word because, followed by the supporting reasons. The ontheme here is all CIU students should take a workshop on writing an argument because arguments are not only the major form of academic writing, but it is also logically persuasive and includes evidence for the claim made. So you see, that's a pretty good thesis statement, and we'll get to where we put that in the written argument in a few minutes. And in fact, where should we put the claim or the ontheme in the paper? Where should it appear in the paper? Well, the first paragraph or first paragraphs, if it needs to be spread over more than one paragraph, but at least the first paragraph of a good argument paper really needs to accomplish two tasks. And one of the most important of those tasks is to grab the reader's attention. Because people don't persist in a piece of writing unless you grab their attention. You don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time in the paper to grab their attention. You don't want to eat up all the space there, but you do want to say something that will grab the reader's attention, let them know that this is a really important issue for them and in the ways it may be important. Thus, it's important for the writer to have a really clear idea about who the reader is going to be. It's always important to think about the audience and what will the audience, how the audience might react to this, how this might be of value to the audience. The clearer idea you have of the nature of that audience, the better that you can try to grab their attention. So grabbing the reader's attention is really an important task in the first paragraph of the argument paper. The second is to state the claim, plus a brief statement of supporting reasons. And we said that that is can be done in an ontheme, and that's an efficient way to get that done. In other words, in that first paragraph, it needs perhaps an ontheme that's made up of the claim and the supporting reasons. Hope that's clear. Let me give an example of that in terms of the grounds. Now remember, we said that the supporting reasons need grounds, and so it's important that we look at those grounds. Okay, that one of those might be a survey of all CIU students found that 80% of all of the assignments were supposed to be written in argument form. So that's a relevant piece of evidence. Or another relevant piece of evidence might be that most CIU students report that when they failed to give evidence for the claims in their paper, they received a low grade. Third might be that CIU professors believe that arguments are more logically persuasive than other forms of writing, or that arguments are more objective and less subjective than many other forms of writing. And especially in graduate school, but also in upper level undergrad, we really want to move toward objectivity and spend less time on just making subjective claims. Now, these are grounds or pieces of evidence for the claim and the supporting reasons that I'm giving. But what are the assumptions that I may be making by using this evidence and by the claim and the supporting reason? Here are some that I just cited upon off the top of my head. One might be that the more frequent a type of writing is required at the university indicates that it is most logically the most logically persuasive form of writing. We don't know that. That's an assumption, okay? And if my audience agrees with that assumption, then maybe I don't need to do anything. But if I think my audience might not agree with that, then I might want to include some evidence in support of that assumption. Another assumption might be that the primary reasons that students receive poor grades in their writing assignments at the university is because they didn't write in argument form. So if my audience might disagree with that, then I might need to give some evidence for that. And then the third one is giving evidence to support a claim is an adequate indicator of objectivity. Well, is that? Some individuals might say, well, there are other ways to come across as objective rather than just giving evidence. And so if that's the case, then I need to give some evidence to support this warrant or these assumptions, okay? So as you can see, we've really kind of covered the necessary parts of an argument. If you do that, then you're going to be writing a good argument. So let me look at the backing. Backing, remember, is the evidence that we use in support of an assumption. Backing is only required if that assumption, in our estimation, the assumptions are controversial and that some of my audience may disagree with them. If I know that everybody would agree with my assumptions, then there's probably not a requirement to give backing. It's always a good idea anyway, especially because you never quite know whether the audience will agree with your assumptions. So one of the ways to kind of come up with the backing is to ask yourself whether other people would disagree with those warrants. And if they are, then you really need to include the backing or evidence for the assumption. One of those might be ask yourself whether it's true that the more frequent a type of writing is required at CIU indicates that it is the most logically persuasive form of writing. And then if you think that that's controversial, then give some evidence. Or that the primary reason students receive a poor grade on writing assignments at the university is because they failed to write an argument form. You think there's going to be disagreement there, then give some evidence. And then the same is giving evidence to support a claim is an adequate indicator of objectivity. And again, if you think that's controversial, then you would need to give evidence to back that up. Okay. So we've looked at where the claim and the general supporting reasons, in particular the enthymeme, where it should appear within the paper, and in the paper itself, that typically will occur within the first paragraph or so, really early in the paper. It's not that the enthymeme has to be the first sentence in that first paragraph, but it really needs to be present because that's going to be the meat of the body of your paper, is the unfolding of that. But where should the grounds or the evidence and the assumptions and the evidence backing up those assumptions appear in the paper? Well, all of these will appear outside the introduction, outside those introductory paragraphs where you make the thesis statement in the form of an enthymeme. And so the grounds, the warrants, and the backing appear in the body of the paper, and they're going to consist in several different paragraphs. And one of the things that we need to think about as a writer is how are we going to organize the paragraphs? Well, one way to do that is to organize the paragraphs, is to devote a paragraph to each piece of evidence supporting the claim. Cover one piece of evidence and then move to the next. However, if the warrants associated with that evidence need to be stated because they might be controversial, then the warrants associated with each bit of evidence should be stated, and the backing or the evidence supporting the warrant should be present. So you might have within the paragraph, right, the evidence supporting the claim, and the warrants, especially if those are controversial, and then the evidence for your warrants, and then move to the second piece of evidence supporting the claim, which you've already stated them in the as supporting reasons in the enthymeme. So we're really unfolding what we said in the enthymeme, and this part is in the body of the paper. Some important considerations when we're writing an argument are as follows. Always consider how an informed audience, someone that would understand what you're talking about, an informed audience that happens to be skeptical about what you might be saying. So always consider how an informed skeptic in your audience would criticize the following parts of your argument. Your claim. Maybe they're going to be skeptical because they need your terms clearly defined. And if you need to define those terms clearly, do it within the first paragraph or so. So are the terms clear, and are they defined where necessary? Another thing that you want to look at where the skepticism needs to be addressed is in the grounds or the evidence. Is there enough evidence to support your claim? Maybe you didn't give enough evidence. So be sure you give enough evidence to support your claim. And is the evidence relevant to the claim? If the evidence you give isn't really relevant, then it's kind of useless to you, and it actually will hurt your argument. And then the other thing is to look at the assumptions, the warrants. Would an informed skeptic agree with the warrants and the assumptions? And if not, then you need to give backing or evidence to support your warrants or the assumptions. So consider these points as you go through writing the argument, and especially when you're editing the argument at the end of the paper. And sometimes you may have give your paper to someone who might, one of your friends who might be a bit skeptical about things, and just have them look at it and bring up some objections whatsoever. So you can use that help from your friend to improve your paper. Some additional considerations. When you are giving evidence, it is really important that you're cautious using examples from personal experience as evidence. If you can do that, you can give examples from personal experience, but don't do that too much. It is because that's one bit of evidence, and we need something that is beyond just one piece of evidence. Your life may not be representative of every other life. So while it be relevant, it is not sufficient as evidence in the paper. So always include additional, more objective and generalizable evidence in your paper if you use personal experience. I rarely use personal experience because I'm typically writing research papers where that wouldn't be really relevant. If you use interviews or questionnaires or surveys, they can be very helpful pieces of evidence, but if they are balanced, objective, and they don't have bias. So take a look that the interviews and the questionnaires, the questions that you're asked are not leading questions that will look like you are biased and subjective, and you're not real balanced about the subject. So make sure these instruments are really balanced. Also, if you do a library or internet search, always carefully evaluate the online sources for objectivity. Don't simply include data or findings that agree with your claim. We call that special pleading if we just go look for evidence that supports our claim. When we look for evidence, we need to look at evidence that supports our claim and also is against our claim, because that's a more objective and balanced way to do it. Also, the quality of the sources that you look at. If you're looking at a blog, a personal blog, then be skeptical. If it's a scientific paper that has been posted, then you can be safer using that as a source. Okay, so be critical when you look at your library internet search sources. Additional considerations. If you give testimony, that's okay to use that in your argument, especially if it is testimony of an expert. But again, testimony of an expert is just testimony of that one expert. And so you have to be aware of the bias of that individual. if you're going to have testimony, it is better if you have testimony from someone who kind of agrees with what your argument is about, and testimony of someone who doesn't, and that would be far more balanced. If you use statistical data, which is very helpful, you need to look at how those data were gathered. Analogies, a lot of people like analogies in arguments, but let's be very clear. Analogies tend to be the weakest form of argument, so be aware when you do it. It's okay if you use an analogy, but make sure that is not the only kind of evidence you're giving, because analogies are always comparing one thing to another thing. And there are always relevant dissimilarities between the two things that are being compared. So you open yourself up for criticism from a skeptical member of your audience or your readership if they go, wow, that's a weak analogy, because the differences between these two situations that you're comparing are really more relevant than the similarities. So just realize that it can be engaging to your audience, but it also can be attacked. And so you need to make sure you have other forms of evidence. One of the ways that I like to look at it, which I got by reading the writing of Charles Saunders Peirce, who was one of the first the American pragmatist philosophers, said that when we have an argument, think of an argument more in terms of a cable than a chain. If you just link pieces of evidence in your argument, then and they build upon each other, your argument is only going to be as strong as the weakest link. However, if in your argument you have multiple forms of evidence, testimony, statistical data, quotes, from experts, surveys, questionnaires, as all different kinds of data, those are different strands in the cable and make for a much stronger kind of argument. So, I want to talk here about writing the argument itself. So we've seen what goes in the introduction, where the thesis statement occurs, the enthymeme, and we've looked at the body. And when you were in maybe middle school and high school, you learned about the traditional 5-point essay. And if you remember, there was an introduction. In the body of the paper, there were 3 paragraphs, and in each paragraph you made a specific point. And then you wrote a conclusion that functioned as a brief summary of the paper. We tend not to use that so much in the university because we are doing far more complicated or complex analyses of issues that can't be contained in the 5-point essay. I think it's better for us to focus not as much on structure, but more on the function of what the argument is. And then the argument, we're trying to be logically persuasive. And we may need a body of a paper that has far more than 3 paragraphs. You use as many as you need to make your case and argue your claim, okay? So a better form than the traditional 5-point essay would be as follows. Be sure to include the claim and the major support, as in the enthymeme format, in the first paragraph or so. If you need to define your terms, include that in the first paragraph or so. In the introduction, avoid, just overly general, vague, and flowery language. I remember it was a rather humorous example, but reading a paper that was written by a student, not in my class, and they were talking about sexual behavior, and they said, sex has been around for a long time. And they didn't mean it as a humorous statement. I'm like, why put that in there? It's so vague, it's so general, it's so intuitively obvious that it doesn't need to be stated. And in the argument, it's not the introduction is not a time to do creative writing. It's not supposed to have a lot of flowery language. You want to grab the attention, but use efficiency of words in doing so. Included in that better form is that each of the following paragraphs after the introduction should focus on one bit of evidence to support the major claim, and use as many paragraphs as you need to cover all the evidence. We call it exclusive and exhaustive. Include everything that needs to be covered to support your claim, but don't add anything that's unnecessary. Don't constantly repeat yourself or add irrelevant material. And then the conclusion should briefly discuss the degree to which the truthfulness of the claim has been established and areas where further work may need to be done. Okay, so this is really important when we're writing, and remember, the purpose is going to determine the structure. Whereas in the traditional 5-point essay, the structure was the major consideration. Now we're doing more complex writing, then we need to focus more on the purpose of what we're trying to achieve in our argument. Let me give the first paragraph in an argument in what we've used as an example. And I'm not saying that this is the best, it is one possibility. Writing arguments at Columbia International University take many forms, including narrative, expository, and among the different forms of expository is writing. All CIU students should take a workshop on writing an argument, because arguments are not only one of the major forms of expository academic writing, but are also logically persuasive and include evidence for the stated claims. There are numerous other forms of evidence for the primary importance of writing arguments well in an academic setting. That is, arguments that are logically persuasive and have relevant and adequate evidence supporting the claims of an argument. And then I could have put something like in there, do you want to do a better job at succeeding in your academic career? Consider taking a workshop on writing arguments. So that would have been more to grab the attention. I didn't put it in here. And so one way to improve this first paragraph would be for me to do a better job of grabbing the attention. Do notice that the thesis statement in this paragraph, which is the second sentence, is written in enthymeme form. And therefore, once I've stated those stated reasons that support the claim, I know I can look back and that will be the structure of what goes in the body of the paper, because I need to cover every bit of evidence that I promised that I would cover. Example of the concluding paragraph. Various forms of evidence have been advanced in support of the claim that all CIU students should take a workshop on writing an argument, because arguments are not only one of the major forms of expository academic writing, but are also logically persuasive and include evidence for the stated claims. Among these forms of evidence that are both relevant and adequate to support the claims are surveys of both CIU students and professors on this issue, the description of the goals of academic writing to logically persuade readers, excuse me, the logical structure of arguments over and above other forms of writing, and statistics on the types of writing assignments required in upper-level undergraduate and graduate courses. Clearly, it is warranted to offer CIU workshops on writing effective arguments to all CIU students. So notice I end kind of saying I've done my job and proven that offering a writing workshop would be important. But I didn't say, by the way, I've proven my point. That would be too obvious. We want to not be so obvious. And by the way, also notice I didn't use I. I don't refer to myself anywhere within this paper. And typically in a really academic paper, we don't make self-reference, except perhaps in a personal example, but then that should be minimized in a paper. So now we know how to write a good argument. Now I just want to include one bit of information for you. If you really want to write an excellent argument, it's not a whole lot more work, but it is so important in terms of outcome and really establishing your case. So let's look at that. So far, we've created a good argument. We have an introduction that has an attention grabber, explanation of the issue, why it's important, and the thesis statement in that form of an enthymeme. The body of the paper is going to be the presentation of the writer's position. It's going to present and support each bit of evidence, and then the evidence is going to be tied to the value or belief held by the reader audience. Notice, because that'll be more persuasive if we appeal to their values, etc. And then in the conclusion, we're going to sum up the argument and leave a strong final impression on the reader, the audience, that we have done an adequate job of logically thinking about this. Okay, that is what we've covered so far. I want to add what is often called the computatio and create a great argument. A great argument carefully anticipates the strongest objections an informed skeptical audience would have, and then refutes those objections. This thing of anticipating and stating the objections of an informed skeptical audience and then refuting those objections is called the computatio, and it's made up of two parts. One, you summarize the opposing view, the view that is opposed to yours, and you must summarize that fairly and completely. If you don't, we call that a straw man argument. A straw man argument is where we take a complex argument, we oversimplify it or we misrepresent it, and we argue against the oversimplification and misrepresentation. That is grossly unfair, and you come across as not objective at all. So you want to summarize the opposing view with the principle of charity, be fair, and be complete. And then you want a response to that opposing view. And you can do this in several different ways. The writer can fully outright refute the view, or they could refute some of it and concede that the opposing view does have some good points. In fact, that is a wonderfully balanced way to write. So one, show the weakness in the logic of the opposing view, or concede that the opposing view does have some strengths along with the weaknesses. If they only have strengths and there's no weaknesses, then we need to reconsider our own claim. So this is what goes in the computatio. It may take several paragraphs to accomplish, especially if there's more than one important opposing view. But where does this go in the paper? This is pretty simple. Where does the computatio appear in the paper? These paragraphs occur after the presentation of the writer's position in the main body of the paper, okay? So you go in your body, you've covered one data point, your assumptions, and then if you need evidence for your assumption, then you move to your next stated support. Once you've done all of that, then you have a whole section that may be comprised of several paragraphs in which you move away from your position, and now you consider the opposing views. And for each opposing view or aspect of the opposing view, you devote a paragraph to it. And remember, in that paragraph, it may take more than one paragraph, but typically a paragraph, then you state what the position is fairly and accurately, and then you refute it or refute plus concede that some of the points are good. So they appear after what your view is and your analysis of your view and your supporting of that, and the computatio appears immediately before the conclusion. I hope this is of some help to you, and that you do a great job when you write your argument at the university, and you all do really well on your homework assignments. All the best, and have a great day.